There is an art to creating a good villain. It's one thing to write a character who you as an author agree with. As we've discussed, there are significant challenges to communicating moral ideas in games, but at least what is considered right, however poorly communicated, is often embodied in the hero. What is distressing about modern story-oriented games is that finding a good villain that is sane is getting harder and harder. Far too often games resort to the crazy villain stereotype, and this reliance on insanity does damage to the narrative in a number of ways. This particularly comes into play when talking about that old standby of gaming that is taking the place of a well-conceived villain. Without further ado, I introduce the Crazy Cultist, that toxic mix of insanity and beliefs that create a villain that will destroy the world for no discernible logical reason. Now, before we go further, I'd like to make one thing clear. I'm not dismissing the Crazy Cultist villain as a villain type in total. The Crazy Cultist has his place in certain gaming narratives. For example, the new game with the old title Doom has a Crazy Cultist as an antagonist. Although the narrative makes it clear that the antagonist is manipulated by demons, the context is she's following a demon cult. But the whole thing is paper thin for a paper thin plot. It's like the game is winking at you that the plot is stupid, so go kill things. And while one might raise an objection to pointless violence being glorified in a game, at least Doom doesn't pretend to be some Homeric epic. The problem comes when the Crazy Cultist comes up in a more narrative-driven game. A game story that works so hard to create cool heroes only to be undermined by poor villains is a tragedy. And a weak villain not only undermines the overall story, but the moral universe that forms the foundation of that story. If you want an example of this problem, one needs to look no further than the latest in the Tomb Raider series, Rise of the Tomb Raider. In this installment, the main villain is a murderous former military buff by the name of Constantine, who is a member of the shadowy organization Opus Dei, Trinity, funded by someone in the Vatican no less. Finally, he has in his hands what appears to be an injury that resembles a stigmata, just in case the imagery is too subtle. Anyways, Constantine is nuts, and the narrative makes it clear that any time he might feel doubt about his vaguely defined holy cause, he gets reassurance from his faith, quote-unquote. He tortures and murders his way to obtain the divine source, an artifact that claims to give the possessor immortality. He hopes to use this artifact to cure his sister, who has some terminal illness of some kind. What really stinks about this is that the overall narrative theming of the game is surprisingly solid. The main narrative theme is obsession, and the narrative explores different ways that obsession is self-destructive. Laura, for example, is obsessed with the divine source because it will prove her father's research right. This is a very personal motivation to the point of endangering whatever friends she hasn't pushed away in her pursuit. The Remnant, the group who have been protecting the artifact for centuries, have been dying off, literally, because of constant warfare to protect it. This, for a lack of a better term, is a social obsession with the artifact rooted in history. It's very well done. At one point where Laura and the head of the Remnants are trying to convince each other that their obsession is self-destructive, it's layered with nuance and hidden meanings. To me, it was the highlight of the narrative. Unfortunately, Constantine, by making him a religious nutter, undermines the narrative, or at least severely damages it. By introducing religious-induced insanity into the mix, Constantine's motivation is not obsession, but a desire to cure his sister through evil means that are sanctioned by his beliefs. This undermines the theming by identifying Constantine's brutality with his vaguely defined beliefs, and not the obsession with finding the artifact. Ironically, Constantine's motivation is arguably the most noble one. Rather than Laura's personal pride of a sort in resurrecting her father's good name, or the Remnant's tribal principles, Constantine's desire is very simple: to heal his sister. One could say his motivation is the most honorable, as it's rooted not in pride but in familial love. Now, obviously, as that Catholic gamer dude, the portrayal of religion in the game as having only negative connotations is going to rankle me. Being funded by a Vatican insider is just icing on the cake, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But the thing that gets me about this crazy cultist narrative is that it's completely unnecessary. Imagine a non-crazy Constantine who, despite some moral flexibility with killing people, he is otherwise a family man. And when his sister gets sick, he becomes obsessed, notice the use of the theme, with finding a cure. After committing atrocities on this quest, he gets the attention of the Jesuits, Trinity. They point him in the right direction to the artifact, and thus our adventure begins. This not only fits in with the obsession theme, but could have shown even more ways of how obsession is destructive. Laura could then represent a moral person wrestling with a possessive obsession. The Remnant could represent a society clinging to a self-destructive idea. Finally, Constantine could represent what happens when a person who does not have a moral foundation becomes obsessed. It would also serve as a contrast between Laura and Constantine. Laura would represent how a moral person deals with a failing like obsession. Constantine could have shown how a person without moral principles deals with the same. A perfect contrast between moral ways and immoral ways to deal with a particular human failing. Unfortunately, by adding vague, destructive religious beliefs into the mix, the character of Constantine is now ambiguous. The insanity aspect of Constantine's character, fueled by a faulty religious element, confuses what the villain actually represents. Does he represent an obsessed individual with religious impulses that are twisted because of obsession? Or is it the religious impulses that cause the obsession? One may counter that the author's point is that an obsessed individual can use religion as a means to assuage guilt over evil actions. This is a standard assertion of some forms of modern atheism. But if true, this would fall into the category of an unstated assumption, and in doing so only undermines the narrative even further. A good villain's job, yes, I'm aware of the irony in a statement like that, is to draw attention to a contrast between the hero's ideas and the villain. The contrast is supposed to show how the hero is right and the villain is wrong. When the villain is just insane, either by religious or other means, the author isn't communicating a point, he's just stereotyping the opposing view. This is yet another reason why games tend toward ultimate good portrayals and villains worse than Hitler. Stock portrayals are fine for games where the narrative is just background noise. Games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, whose narrative is more developed, must put time and effort into their villains. Otherwise, it's like the King's Speech with the Joker as the enemy. We'll go into a more general presentation of Villain-ology in a future video. Suffice it to say that for now, while disappointing villains are not exclusive to video games, there's a real need for video game writers to stop defaulting to crazy villains and start thinking in terms of how to give their villains stories that hold up to reason. A conflict is only as strong as the presence of their participants. That's all for now. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.